I didn't stop them when the first truck rolled past my rusted gate. I didn't argue when the survey flags appeared across the dry grass like little warnings no one else could read. And I definitely didn't say a word when the concrete trucks arrived, churning loudly, pouring foundations into soil that had belonged to my family for 43 years. I watched. I waited. I wrote everything down. Because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is letting people finish their mistake. The men in hard hats laughed with each other, assuming the quiet man standing near the fence line was just a curious neighbor. The project manager waved at me once, friendly, distracted, confident. He had no idea he was building an entire neighborhood on land I legally owned. By the third week, wooden frames rose into the sky like ribs of giant skeletons. By the second month, roofs appeared. Windows followed. Driveways stretched across what used to be my grandfather's grazing field. I could still picture him there, mending wire, whistling softly, never imagining 98 houses would stand where his cattle once wandered. Every evening I sat on the tailgate of my truck, pretending to scroll through my phone while secretly filming progress. Date stamps. Faces. Company logos. Permit numbers printed on bright boards. I collected evidence the way other people collect souvenirs. Calmly. Patiently. The Homeowners Association banner went up near the entrance before the houses were even painted. Future Community of Silver Ridge, it read. I smiled the first time I saw it, because they had unknowingly named my evidence for me. Silver Ridge was the exact title written across the original deed folded inside my kitchen drawer. Friends asked why I didn't confront anyone. Why I didn't call the police. Why I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I told them the truth. Timing matters. Proof matters more. I visited the county records office quietly, requesting certified copies of maps older than most of the construction crew. I highlighted boundary lines. I compared signatures. I built a folder thicker than a novel. By the time families started touring model homes, I was ready. Lawns were seeded. Mailboxes installed. Street signs bolted into the ground. They had finished everything for me. The morning I finally made my move, the sales office smelled like fresh paint and coffee. I walked in carrying nothing but a thin brown envelope. The receptionist smiled politely. I asked for the project manager by name. When he came out, cheerful, confident, I placed the envelope on his desk. You built all this, I said, on my land. His smile faded slowly, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. He laughed once, nervously. Then he opened the deed. Silence filled the room. The project manager didn't blink at first. He skimmed the paper, still smiling, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. Then his eyes slowed. His lips stopped moving. He read the same line again, tracing the boundary description with his finger as if the ink might rearrange itself. It didn't. The air in the office changed, growing heavier, quieter, aware. He asked where I got this. I told him the truth. My kitchen drawer. He forced a laugh that landed flat. This has to be a mistake, he said. I nodded politely. That's what I thought too, which is why I brought copies. I placed the county maps beside the deed. His confidence began draining visibly. He called someone from legal. Then someone from planning. The receptionist stopped typing and just watched. Through the glass walls, I could see framed photos of happy families taped to boards, marketing dreams already sold. He asked me to sit. I remained standing. I told him I had visited the site daily. I described trucks, crews, permits, dates, everything documented. I slid printed photographs across the desk. His hands trembled slightly now. He kept saying this couldn't be happening. I assured him it already had. 10 minutes later, 2 men arrived, suits sharp, faces tense. They introduced themselves without warmth. They examined every page carefully. One asked how long I had known. I told him since the first survey flag. He stared at me like I was either patient or dangerous. Maybe both. They whispered together near the window. I watched their reflections instead of turning around. Outside, a young couple walked toward the model home, holding hands, smiling, unaware. That sight almost made me feel guilty. Almost. One lawyer finally asked what I wanted. I said nothing yet. I simply wanted them to understand the situation fully. He didn't like that answer. People prefer demands. Silence makes them nervous. They requested time to investigate. I agreed, calmly. Before leaving, I reminded them construction was still active. Workers were still adding value to my property. That sentence landed harder than anything else. The project manager looked pale now. I walked out slowly, past brochures, scale models, hopeful posters, and stepped into sunlight that felt strangely satisfying. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking for updates. I ignored them. This part required quiet. I drove back toward the site and parked near the entrance again. The Silver Ridge sign gleamed proudly. I filmed it once more. Workers hammered, saws screamed, progress continued. None of them knew a clock had started ticking above their heads. I checked the date on my phone and smiled quietly. The mistake was no longer theirs alone. It now belonged to paperwork, signatures, and consequences waiting patiently ahead for everyone. That afternoon, the construction pace didn't slow. If anything, it felt louder, more urgent, as if the entire site sensed pressure building without knowing why. Nail guns cracked like small explosions. Trucks reversed with sharp beeps. Workers shouted measurements across half-built driveways. Life went on, unaware that the ground beneath it had quietly shifted from certainty to dispute. I stayed in my usual spot near the fence line, filming casually, pretending to be nothing more than a bored neighbor. A few workers recognized me now and nodded in greeting. One even joked that I should apply for a job since I spent so much time watching. I smiled back, knowing I already had the most important role here. By evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered calmly. It was one of the lawyers from earlier. His voice had lost its earlier sharpness. He asked if we could meet the next morning at the county records office with a surveyor present. I agreed immediately. This was moving faster than I expected. That night, I laid the documents across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I had solved weeks ago. The original deed, yellowed slightly with age. The certified maps. Tax records showing continuous payments from my account for decades. Even my grandfather's handwritten notes referencing boundary stones that still existed along the tree line. I slept peacefully. The next morning, the county office felt colder than usual. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The lawyer stood near the counter with a professional surveyor and two officials from planning. No one smiled. We spread the maps across a wide table. The surveyor pulled out measuring tools and digital overlays. Coordinates were compared. Lines traced. Distances calculated twice. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, the surveyor leaned back and said the words none of them wanted to hear. The active construction site sits entirely within this boundary. He tapped my map. One of the planning officials whispered something under his breath. The lawyer removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes slowly. No one argued. There was nothing to argue against. Numbers don't bend for pride. They asked how this could have happened. The planning official admitted the development had been approved based on a newer subdivision map submitted by the HOA, which apparently referenced an outdated boundary file. A clerical error, he called it. 98 houses standing on a clerical error. I remained quiet, letting the weight of that settle naturally. The lawyer asked what my next step would be. I told him I preferred to let the process unfold properly. That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. As we packed up the papers, I noticed their tone had changed completely. Respect had replaced dismissal. Concern had replaced confidence. Outside the window, I could see the tops of unfinished roofs in the distance. They looked smaller now, fragile somehow, like they were built on air instead of earth. By the time we stepped out of the county office, the mood had shifted from confusion to quiet alarm. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood the scale of what had happened. This wasn't a fence dispute or a misplaced shed. This was an entire neighborhood rising on the wrong piece of earth. The lawyer walked beside me to the parking lot, speaking carefully now, choosing words as if each one might trigger something expensive. He asked whether I had already contacted an attorney. I told him not yet. That answer surprised him more than anything else I had said all morning. He suggested we pause construction immediately. I told him that decision wasn't mine to make. The land was mine. The mistake was theirs. That afternoon, I returned to the site again. But something had changed. Supervisors stood in tight circles, talking quietly. Fewer jokes. Less shouting. The rhythm of the place felt uncertain, like music playing slightly offbeat. Rumors travel fast among workers. A few of them looked at me differently now. Curious. Suspicious. One man approached and asked if the project was in trouble. I shrugged gently and said I didn't know. By sunset, several trucks had already left early. The next day, I received an official letter from the HOA's legal team requesting a formal meeting. They used careful language, full of phrases like potential discrepancy and boundary clarification. I smiled reading it. Paper had finally caught up with reality. We met in a conference room overlooking the half-finished homes. 4 board members sat across from me, along with 2 lawyers and the project manager who now looked permanently exhausted. They tried to keep the tone polite, professional, hopeful. They asked what resolution I wanted. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A copy of my deed. I want you to understand, I said calmly, that everything outside this window belongs to me. No threats. No raised voice. Just truth. One board member whispered that families had already paid deposits. Another mentioned bank loans. The project manager kept staring at the roofs outside like they might disappear if he wished hard enough. They proposed buying the land from me. Quickly. Quietly. I asked for time to think. Because I already knew something they didn't. The value of land changes when 98 houses are standing on it. And I had waited this long for a reason. I didn't answer their offer that day. I thanked them for the meeting, folded my copy of the deed, and walked out without giving a number, a condition, or even a hint. The silence I left behind in that conference room was louder than any demand I could have made. That evening, my phone rang constantly. Unknown numbers. Voicemails from people introducing themselves as legal advisors, consultants, mediators. Word had spread beyond the HOA board. This had become a problem with layers. I ignored every call. Instead, I drove back to the site just before sunset. The golden light washed over the rows of nearly finished homes, making them look peaceful, innocent, like they had always belonged there. Sprinklers ticked softly across newly planted lawns. A delivery truck unloaded kitchen cabinets. Life continued, unaware that ownership had quietly shifted into uncertainty. I filmed everything again. Slowly. Methodically. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. This one was more direct. The HOA was formally requesting negotiation for land purchase. They emphasized urgency, mentioning financial risk, contractual obligations, and homeowner expectations. Still no number. They wanted me to speak first. I smiled at that. Instead of replying, I made an appointment with a property attorney in the nearest city. When I spread the documents across his desk, he leaned back in his chair and stared at me for a long moment. "You let them finish?" he asked. I nodded. He laughed once, softly, not out of humor but disbelief. Then he said something I'll never forget. "This is one of the strongest positions I've ever seen. We calculated potential land value based on current development. Roads, utilities, infrastructure, market rates. Every addition they had built increased what they now effectively owed me." The number climbed quietly, steadily, until even he paused. He looked at me and said, "You understand this will likely go to court." I told him I had been ready for that since the first survey flag. That afternoon, construction officially paused. No trucks. No noise. Workers stood around waiting for instructions that never came. The site felt strangely hollow without its usual chaos. For the first time, people began asking questions out loud. Who owns this land? What's happening? Why did everything stop? I stayed home that day, organizing my folder one more time, knowing the next phase wouldn't happen on dirt or concrete. It would happen in a courtroom. The court date arrived faster than anyone expected. What usually takes months had been pushed forward by urgency, money, and the number 98 hanging over every conversation like a storm cloud. My attorney said the case had drawn unusual attention because of its scale. Entire developments don't accidentally land on the wrong property very often. That morning, I dressed simply. No suit. No tie. Just clean clothes and the same brown envelope I had carried into the sales office weeks earlier. It felt lighter now, even though it held the weight of everything. Outside the courthouse, I saw them gathered near the steps. HOA board members. Lawyers. The exhausted project manager. Even a few potential homeowners who must have heard rumors and wanted answers. Their faces carried a mix of frustration, worry, and disbelief. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than I imagined. Wooden benches. High ceilings. Quiet whispers bouncing off the walls. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The air tightened. The HOA's legal team spoke first. They used polished language, carefully explaining how an error in boundary records had led to an unfortunate misunderstanding. They emphasized good faith, investment, and community impact. They spoke for a long time without once saying the word mistake. Then it was my turn. My attorney didn't argue loudly. He didn't need to. He simply handed the judge the original deed, certified maps, tax records, and dated photographs of construction from day one. Evidence, stacked calmly. The judge studied the documents silently. The room felt frozen. He asked one question. Has the plaintiff continuously paid property tax on this land? Yes, my attorney replied. He looked toward the HOA table. Did you verify ownership before approving construction? Silence answered for them. The judge leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said words that changed everything. Ownership is not in dispute. You could feel the shift ripple across the room. Suddenly this wasn't about confusion or clerical errors. It was about responsibility. The judge ordered immediate mediation for financial resolution, stating clearly that the land legally belonged to me and any construction upon it had occurred without my permission. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I simply nodded once. Outside the courtroom, the project manager avoided my eyes. The HOA board looked like people trying to wake up from a bad dream. Reporters had started gathering near the steps, sensing a story. I walked past all of them quietly, the same way I had walked past the first survey flags weeks ago. Patient. Calm. Certain. Mediation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a quiet office with a long table, a wall clock that ticked too loudly, and faces that looked far more tired than they had any right to be. The judge's words still echoed in everyone's mind. Ownership is not in dispute. That sentence had stripped away every argument they thought they had. Across from me sat the HOA's legal team, 2 board members, a financial consultant, and the project manager who now looked like he hadn't slept in days. My attorney sat calmly beside me, hands folded, saying very little. They began with numbers. Conservative numbers. Land value before development. Agricultural rates. Rural comparisons. Figures that might have worked if 98 houses weren't standing outside the window. My attorney slid a new document forward. Updated valuation based on developed land, installed utilities, paved roads, market housing rates. The atmosphere changed instantly. The consultant's eyebrows lifted. One board member whispered something under her breath. The numbers doubled. Then tripled. They asked if I was trying to bankrupt the association. I calmly reminded them I hadn't asked them to build anything. They had done that themselves. Hours passed. Coffee cups emptied. Jackets came off. Voices grew softer, less defensive. This was no longer a negotiation about land. It was a negotiation about consequences. At one point, the project manager spoke up quietly. He said families had already planned their futures in those homes. That banks were involved. That lives were waiting on a decision made in this room. I listened without interruption. Then I said something simple. I never stopped you. Silence followed. Because that was the part they still couldn't understand. Why I had watched. Why I had waited. My attorney finally spoke. He explained that if this went back before the judge without agreement, damages could include legal penalties far beyond the land value. Time was not on their side. The consultant recalculated. Papers shuffled. New numbers appeared. By late afternoon, they presented an offer that finally matched reality. Payment for the land at developed market value, plus compensation for unauthorized use, plus legal costs. A number so large the room went quiet after it was spoken. My attorney looked at me. I nodded once. Pens were placed on the table. As signatures filled the pages, relief and exhaustion mixed together across their faces. For them, this was the end of a nightmare. For me, it was simply the conclusion of patience. The paperwork took days to finalize, but the tension lifted the moment the agreement was signed. Funds moved through accounts quietly, professionally, without celebration. My attorney called to confirm everything had cleared. His voice carried a note of disbelief, as if even he hadn't expected the outcome to be this decisive. I drove out to the site one more time after the transfer was complete. Construction had resumed, but the energy was different now. Workers moved with purpose again, conversations louder, tension replaced by relief. The project manager spotted me from a distance and walked over, hesitating slightly before offering a handshake. This time, I shook his hand. No anger remained. No resentment. Just an understanding that mistakes, when ignored long enough, grow expensive. The Silver Ridge sign still stood proudly at the entrance. Fresh paint, polished edges, confident lettering. I filmed it again, not as evidence this time, but as a reminder of how quietly everything had unfolded. Families had started moving into the finished homes. Children rode bikes along sidewalks that hadn't existed a few months ago. Mailboxes now held names instead of numbers. Life had filled the space that once held nothing but dry grass and old fence posts. I parked near the tree line where my grandfather's boundary stones still sat, half buried in soil. I brushed dirt away from one with my shoe and smiled. Those stones had outlasted survey flags, paperwork errors, and 98 concrete foundations. They had simply waited, just like I had. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across rooftops, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt calm. Satisfied. Patient decisions rarely feel dramatic when they finally pay off. They feel inevitable. My phone buzzed with news notifications. Local outlets had picked up the story. Headlines talked about legal oversight, development errors, and a homeowner who waited instead of fighting. I ignored them all. This had never been about attention. It had been about timing. I took one last slow walk along the fence line before heading back to my truck. The same place where I had stood weeks earlier, watching the first trucks arrive, knowing something they didn't. The difference now was simple. They knew too. A few weeks later, the noise of construction faded into ordinary neighborhood sounds. Lawnmowers hummed on weekends. Dogs barked behind wooden fences. Porch lights glowed softly at dusk. If you drove past Silver Ridge now, you would never guess the ground beneath those homes had once carried a secret no one else knew. Life had settled into normal rhythms for everyone involved. For them, it was a fresh start. For me, it was a quiet ending. Sometimes I drove by without stopping, just to observe. Children waiting for school buses. Delivery vans dropping packages at doors. Neighbors waving to each other across driveways. The place looked exactly like what it was always meant to be, a community. The only difference was that its existence had quietly rewritten the value of my patience. Friends still asked why I hadn't stopped the construction immediately. Why I hadn't marched in with papers on the first day. I would just smile and say the same thing. Because I wanted them to finish. They laughed when I said it, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The brown envelope that had started everything now rested in a drawer again, back where it had been before this began. The deed hadn't changed. The land hadn't moved. Only circumstances had shifted around it. One evening, I stood at the old fence line during sunset, watching golden light spill across rooftops that used to be open field. I could almost see my grandfather there again, leaning on the wire, nodding quietly as if he understood every step I had taken. Patience isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's watching people build their own consequences while you hold the proof in your hands.
The HOA never connected me again after the agreement. There was nothing left to say. The problem had been solved in the most expensive ways possible. As I turned to leave, I looked back on a final time at the silver edged sign near the entrance. It stood firm, polished, proud, a symbol of community built on a mistake that taught everyone involved a lesson they would never forget. And I realized something simple. They had built 98 house, but I had built the case.